The only real difference between him and Basil is that he was small and had a very large henpecking wife.
So I didn't have any problems with saying what I didn't think was funny. No, I don't believe that. Why does he say that?
There are television shows that entertain, and then there are television shows that endure. Most programs fill an hour of an evening and vanish without a trace, forgotten before the credits finish rolling. A rare few burrow so deeply into the culture that they become part of the furniture of a nation's imagination, referenced in Parliament, quoted in pubs, studied in universities, and argued about in living rooms long after their final episode aired. Fawlty Towers belongs to that second, extraordinarily small category. 12 episodes, 2 seasons, 1 hotel, and a legacy so enormous, so complicated, and so fiercely contested that it is still making headlines today. At the center of that legacy sits one episode, a single, 30-minute masterpiece called The Germans. And within that episode, one scene so inflammatory that it eventually forced the show off the air entirely. To understand how that moment came to pass, you have to begin not with television, but with a real hotel on the English coast, and a real man whose extraordinary rudeness changed the course of British comedy forever. In 1970, John Cleese found himself staying at a seaside hotel in Torquay, Devon, while filming with the Monty Python team. He had stayed in many hotels. He had encountered many eccentric proprietors, but nothing in his experience had prepared him for the manager of the Gleneagles Hotel, a man named Donald Sinclair, whose approach to hospitality was so spectacularly, almost artistically wrong that it left everyone who encountered him simultaneously appalled and fascinated. Sinclair treated his guests not as valued customers, but as inconveniences, interruptions to the smooth running of an establishment that would function far better without the nuisance of actual human beings. He corrected table manners with the condescension of a disappointed headmaster. He regarded luggage with open suspicion. When Eric Idle left a briefcase unattended in the lobby, Sinclair, apparently convinced it was an explosive device, simply threw it over the garden wall. No explanation, no apology, just the brief arc of a leather briefcase against a Torquay sky. For most people, this would have been an occasion for outrage, followed by a strongly worded letter. For John Cleese, it was something far more valuable. It was a character. Cleese took what he had witnessed, that magnificent, infuriating collision of pretension, incompetence, paranoia, and social aggression, and transformed it into Basil Fawlty, the hotel manager who would become one of the most recognizable figures in the history of British comedy. Everything that made Donald Sinclair so impossibly difficult to deal with, Cleese amplified, sharpened, and set to a comic rhythm, so precise it felt almost musical. The volcanic temper, the withering contempt for anyone deemed socially inferior, the desperate, deluded performance of refinement that collapsed into chaos at the slightest provocation. Basil Fawlty was a man perpetually at war with his own limitations, and he could never win. The show was created in partnership with Connie Booth, Cleese's wife at the time, and their collaboration was remarkable in its discipline and ambition. Each episode of Fawlty Towers took approximately 6 weeks to write, an almost unheard-of investment for a sitcom. The scripts that emerged from that process were extraordinary constructions, layered with physical comedy, psychological acuity, and a ferocious understanding of the British class system. The chaos you saw on screen, the flying saucepans, the collapsing walls, the shrieking arguments, was the product of painstaking, meticulous craft. Not a single pratfall was accidental. Not a single misunderstanding was random. Every disaster was engineered with the precision of a Swiss watchmaker who had, inexplicably, decided to build a bomb. When the show first aired in 1975, it was not immediately embraced by everyone. There were critics who dismissed it, BBC executives who were uncertain about it, and early viewers who found Basil simply too monstrous to be funny. But audiences disagreed, and their instincts were vindicated. Within a short time, Fawlty Towers was not just popular, it was beloved, dissected, quoted verbatim, and recognized as something that transcended the usual expectations of a British sitcom. Decades later, it would be named the greatest British television series ever made. 12 episodes had managed to achieve what hundreds of others, spread across dozens of seasons, had never come close to. And then there was The Germans. The episode, which aired as the final installment of the first series in October 1975, begins with Basil attempting to manage the hotel alone while his wife Sybil recovers from an operation in hospital. This is, of course, a catastrophic arrangement. A fire breaks out in the kitchen. Basil, in his typical manner, manages to make everything dramatically worse before sustaining a head injury that leaves him concussed. Discharged from hospital with a bandaged head and rattled nerves, he returns to the hotel just in time to greet a party of German guests who have arrived to stay. What follows is one of the most famous sequences in British television history. Concussed, confused, and possessed by a compulsion he cannot control, Basil begins talking about the Second World War. He instructs his staff not to mention it. He tells himself not to mention it. He is absolutely, categorically incapable of not mentioning it. References to Hitler, to the conflict, to the Nazis pour out of him with the unstoppable force of a man trying desperately to hold back a flood with his bare hands. The German guests, initially puzzled, become increasingly alarmed. The scene climaxes with Basil Goose stepping through the hotel dining room with his finger pressed beneath his nose in imitation of Hitler's mustache, while his guests stare in horrified disbelief. The audience laughed. Britain laughed. Germany, when the show eventually aired there years later, largely laughed as well. The German viewers understood, correctly, that the joke was not about them. It was about Basil. It was about a certain kind of Englishman who had never truly moved on from 1945, who kept the war preserved in amber somewhere in his chest, who measured the world in terms of a conflict that had ended before many of his guests had been born. The Germans in the episode are dignified, patient, and entirely reasonable. Basil is the disaster. Basil is always the disaster. John Cleese said this himself, clearly and repeatedly. The episode was never a mockery of Germany. It was a mockery of the British obsession with the Second World War, a satire of men like Basil who defined themselves against an enemy that existed only in their own frozen imaginations. The target of every joke was English provincialism and English snobbery, not any foreign nation. But buried within the same episode was another scene, quieter, shorter, and in many ways more charged. It involved Major Gowan, the hotel's elderly resident played by Ballard Berkeley, with a magnificently befuddled authority. In his scene, the Major sits at breakfast and recounts a cricket match he once attended, casually deploying racial slurs to describe the players from the West Indies and India. The words were deeply offensive. They were meant to be. Cleese and Booth had written the scene as a portrait of a man whose entire worldview was a relic of empire, a man who used such language without hesitation or awareness, because to him it was simply how the world had always been described. The Major was not presented as a villain. He was presented as something perhaps more uncomfortable, a museum exhibit of a man, a living fossil, laughed at rather than with, a monument to a Britain that was slowly but surely dying. That distinction, laughed at not with, is the entire hinge upon which the argument about the Germans swings. And it is a distinction that, as the decades passed and the world changed, became harder and harder for some viewers to see. For most of its life, the Germans coexisted peacefully with its own controversy. It was celebrated and contested simultaneously, appearing on countless lists of the greatest television episodes ever made, while also generating periodic complaints about its content. It existed in that characteristically British space of the beloved but awkward, the treasured but uncomfortable. Then came the summer of 2020. The death of George Floyd in the United States sent shockwaves through every corner of culture, prompting institutions around the world to examine what they had tolerated, celebrated, or ignored. Streaming platforms removed programs with racist content. Statues came down, and a BBC-owned streaming service called UKTV, conducting a review of its content, quietly removed the Germans from its platform. The reaction was immediate and explosive. The decision made international news. Politicians commented on it. Journalists wrote lengthy columns. John Cleese himself issued a furious public response, calling the removal a failure of understanding and defending both the episode's intentions and its artistic integrity. He argued, with characteristic directness, that only a literal-minded reading of the scene could mistake satire for endorsement, and that removing art because audiences might misread it was a road with no good destination. The BBC eventually reinstated the episode, but not before editing out the major's most offensive language, adding a content warning, and igniting a second wave of argument about whether even that compromise went too far. Cleese objected to the cuts. Those who had wanted the episode removed felt the warning was insufficient. Everyone was unhappy in different directions, which is perhaps the most honest possible outcome for a debate this genuinely difficult. Because the debate is genuinely difficult, it is easy to dismiss those who wanted the scene removed as overly sensitive, and it is equally easy to dismiss those who defended it as nostalgic and blind to the harm language can cause. The truth is more complicated, as truth usually is. The major scene was written with satirical intent, and that intent was real. But intent is not the only thing that matters. Words carry weight regardless of the frame around them, and a joke that made perfect sense in 1975 Britain, where the context was clear and the target was obvious, may land very differently in a different decade, on a different platform, watched by an audience with no access to the cultural conversation that originally surrounded it. What the whole extraordinary episode, the episode within the episode, so to speak, ultimately reveals is the particular danger and the particular power of comedy that is serious about something. Fawlty Towers was never just jokes. It was a ferocious, intelligent, deeply felt examination of class, status, prejudice, and the absurdity of human self-deception. It used laughter as a scalpel. It cut deep. And sometimes, decades later, in a changed world, the cuts are still felt. Not in the way they were intended, but felt nonetheless. John Cleese built something that outlasted its moment. That is the highest achievement available to any artist, and it comes with a cost. Work that is truly alive does not stay still. It travels through time and accumulates meaning and controversy and reverence and argument as it goes. Fawlty Towers is still doing all of those things. The hotel is still standing. The disasters are still unfolding. And somewhere, in a dining room that exists only on a screen, Basil Fawlty is still goose-stepping through history, unable to leave the past behind, which is, in the end, exactly the point.